This is the Canon RF 35mm f1.8 quote macro lens. It's not only a affordable 35mm prime in the RF lineup, but it also does have that macro designation, which in this case means that it can do half macro or 0.5x magnification, which isn't full one-to-one macro, but it is something, and it does get you pretty close to your subject. Of course, to get that maximum magnification, you have to be quite close to the subjects in question. So that is a downside of using a 35mm for macro. Now, this lens does have the bright 1.8 aperture as well, and that is a reason why this lens has often been my low light lens. The autofocus is quite noisy on this lens, and I feel like I should say that right off the bat. It is quite noisy if you're in a very, very quiet environment, and especially if it's hunting. If it's in very, very low light and it's hunting, it will do this type of noise repeatedly. That noise can be kind of annoying, especially if you were in like some sort of extremely quiet type of setting. That could be a problem. The quality of this lens, the build quality, it all feels about what you would expect for a non-L lens in the RF lineup. I think it's pretty consistent with a lot of the others that I've owned, such as the RF 100 to 400. The material that they're built out of feels very much the same. The lens does come with an image stabilizer built in, which is kind of nice because, as I said, this was often my low light lens. So because of that, sometimes you're working at very slow shutter speeds handheld. I was able to do Astro with this lens, you know, like wide sort of Milky Way type thing. It's not my go-to. I think it's a little bit narrow to try and get the full Milky Way, but it is kind of useful if you want a more condensed Milky Way shot. The macro designation was one of the key reasons I originally got this lens. I'm actually not like someone who's huge into either street photography or portraits. I like them, but they're not really especially portraits are not, of people are not really my like main thing. So I didn't get the 35mm for doing that. Believe it or not, the thing that drew me in was the macro designation on this. And while it's not one-to-one, and I do own the 100mm macro, this is still actually pretty nice. And again, the biggest drawback is that you have to be very, very close to the subject in order to get the maximum magnification. And by very close, I mean you're like right up against it, basically. So in some cases, that's not going to work well because being that close to certain subjects is actually going to block the light. So that can be a problem. And unlike the EFM lens, which I think there was one for that which had like a ring light built in, this one doesn't have that. So, and at f1.8, if you choose to use that for the macro, it's a razor thin depth of field. So you definitely have to be wanting that, or you have to go with other methods. Now this lens is pretty small and it's pretty lightweight for a 35mm. So this is definitely suitable for walk-around purposes. I know there's some L lenses where some people might say to themselves, you know, this is too heavy, because there are some like, you know, the 85 1.2L. Some people might be like, that's too heavy for me, I'm not going to do that. This lens, definitely light enough you can walk around with it all day. It's not a problem. This lens has been a very important part of my kit. It was my one of my go-to low light lenses for a long time, especially if you're doing any sort of more low light landscape. It can fill in as an Astro lens, and it can also do the close-up work. So this is a really nice walk-around lens because you can do a variety of things with it. You can get super close, you can do wider shots with it by standing back. Of course, it is a prime lens, so you have to move around manually. I would definitely consider adding this lens to your kit. It brings a lot to the table. Just keep in mind it does have a noisy autofocus, which, you know, as long as you're not in some super quiet social event, shouldn't be a problem. This is definitely a lens that's kind of cool because if you don't know if you're really interested in macro, this is a pretty safe lens to try out that macro functionality without really having to commit to specific macro, like dedicated macro lens, because this is still a lens that can be used for a lot of other things and other purposes. So you're not like stuck with some macro lens you're not going to use. So that's pretty cool.